Okay, good evening, everyone. Today is Friday, August 8th. This is Jose Vega once again with the Edgar Poe class series that we do every Friday. And as usual, I start off with a quick briefing um, before we actually get started with the Poe. And I'm happy to say that Dennis Speed is with us yet again. Um, Boy, I don't even know where to begin because there's just been so much happening. So let me tell you what we started doing. I will work backwards. Today we had the International Peace Coalition call. I believe today was 114. Is that right? Yeah, 114. And the people we had on, first of all, was Anthony Aguilar. Now, this is a name you probably know, or at the very least, you may have seen a video or heard a story of who this guy is. He is the person who went on Tucker Carlson's show and recounted the story about the boy who I believe was kissing his hand, who was later then shot by IDF forces. Various sections of his interviews, of his appearances on various programs have been going viral, whether on Instagram or X or Facebook. I've been seeing it everywhere from very different mediums too. He was just on Katie Halpert's show last night. He was on Tucker Carlson twice. He was on Senator Bernie Sanders' platform and Senator Chris Van Hollen's platform as well. Very clearly, this is a man on a mission who is just trying to get the word out to as many people as possible. And today he joined Helga Zepp-LaRouche on the International Peace Coalition call, which was quite a development. Because not only did he join Helga Zepp-LaRouche, he also joined Ray McGovern and William Binney, and also Kirk Wiebe. Now, these are members of the Veteran Intelligence Professions for Sanity, or the VIPs. And what was so striking about this was to get his briefing, Anthony Aguilar's briefing of what he personally experienced being in Gaza as a contractor for the IDF, placing that in between what Helga was how she opened the conference by situating us strategically as to where we are, not just, of course, with the Russiagate files that have been coming out by Tulsi Gabbard, but of course the war in Ukraine. It looks like there may be a face-to-face meeting with President Trump and Vladimir Putin. There are various developments happening around the world right now that require a role of action from the citizenry. And then, of course, we had Ray McGovern, who came in and he started giving his take as to how he saw the war was going to progress between Ukraine and Russia and the United States. United States' role. Now, one thing that Ray had emphasized was that people should, he said, I am not a fan of Trump, but he said, not by any means. But we should recognize that what he is doing in Ukraine and Russia is a breakthrough moment here. We have an opportunity where the war could actually come to an end. And there was also an interconnectedness as well, that what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is not anything different than what is happening in Israel and Palestine in terms of the forces that are actually having this and commanding this. And then you had Kirk Wiebe and Bill Binney, who were both on talking about what Tulsi Gabbard has been releasing with the Russiagate files, exposing and elaborating more on the role of the cover-up, of Obama's cover-up, and how the intelligence community decided to go forward with the Russiagate allegations, despite the fact that there were never any credible information to begin with to go at the rate that they did, or at the severity that they did to go against President Trump. Now, that was the discussion that took place today, and people can find that either on the Schiller Institute channel or on Garland Nixon's channel. There were about over 700 people who are watching concurrently the stream, and I believe now across all the different platforms it was streamed on, it's somewhere over 4,500 to 5,000 views. Now, the other thing that I did this week too was I was out at the Fox News building. And I had joined my friends at the LaRouche organization as they had a sign that said, Gaza is the new Hiroshima. And we did that on the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And so what happened there was we were there on the corner of 48th Street and 6th Avenue, just like heavy Midtown Manhattan. and we were there, and I was recording a statement that I haven't even edited yet. And as I was pointing to the sign. I was saying, this is the new Hiroshima. This genocide has to stop. It can't be allowed to continue going forward. And there was somebody was about to come up to me and possibly hurt me, but then this individual's wife ended up pulling him away, and they ended up walking away. Now, also, what I saw in reviewing the video was that somebody else in that party that was with them turned around as they were walking away and said, "Free Israel." But then just a total stranger before them turned around and said, "No, free Palestine, brother." And then they both just kept walking. um, and so that all of that, of course, was provoked by just us being out there with this sign that I think is the truth. And not only that, but we met a lot of people out there in the streets, on 48th and 6th, that knew about the Russiagate allegations, who knew the name William Binney, who knew about Thin Thread. And that was the other reason why we had Binney and Weeby on the IPC call, is that these guys were, as Binney in particular, had invented the surveillance system that Palantir is using right now. Not the exact same system, but the same method. It's like Thin Thread on steroids. Everything is just being collected. All forms of surveillance are just being used and deployed right now like crazy. So that's why we had Binney on, and we were out there. And finally, I'll just say, I was also out last Saturday in the Bronx, where you may have seen the compilation I put up, where we had our volunteers go out and join me in the streets. And I got to talk with a lot of a lot of the constituents here in the Bronx. And we were out there, we were raising donations, we were getting contacts, and it was just a lot of fun to be out there. And so, the way I'll end this off is by making a plea with you all. If you want to get out and be active with us, whether it's, helping us out here at the campaign in the Bronx, and in doing that, helping us amplify the message, especially in this month, that Hiroshima is the new Gaza, then you should come and sign up and work with me. You can go to votevega.nyc. And of course, these things take money as well in order to keep our operations alive. So if anything I said here has inspired you, or you feel moved by it, and you want us to continue doing the work that we're doing, please feel free to donate also at votevega.nyc. And you can also sign up and volunteer. So with that, that is the end of my briefing. And now I'm going to bring up Dennis Speed to the stage. So here we go. Dennis, are you there, and can you hear me?
Yeah, hi. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, very good. Thanks a lot for having me here. What I'm going to do so that we can get some time in for the story is very important. We began a story last week, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. It's one of the more famous stories written by Edgar Poe. It's written in November of 1842. It goes right to the heart of what is confronting all of you right now. For example, there was an incident only 48 hours ago when someone said to be a member of the White House floated in the New York Post the assertion that there would be no meeting between President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin unless so-called President Vladimir Zelensky was included. This was then amplified by someone at ABC News, and then this report came in the form of a question to President Trump, at the White House briefing. Now, in the course of the time when this story was first asserted, uh, various people, including, to my direct knowledge, certain people in the intelligence community, repeated it. And we're saying, well, I don't know if it's going to be a meeting because now you have this condition being put on it, and we know that there's no way that President Putin's going to do that. Zelensky has to be there, and all this sort of thing. So there's a lot of speculation. What in fact happened was that when Trump was asked about it, he says, no, that is not a condition of meeting. What occurred during yesterday is that the British press in particular, but German press and other French and other press were completely deflated. German press, as I referenced, all of whom were talking about now that apparently Trump was back in Putin's pocket, when only 3 days earlier, Keir Starmer of Britain and Boris Johnson differently were waxing eloquent about how Trump had seen the light and how his earlier naivete around Putin was now superseded by a clear idea of what was represented. But then they found themselves only days later saying, or not those individuals, but the press saying exactly the opposite. There's something to understand about our world and about the world that we are beginning to see brought to light. And it's very difficult for many people, but it's easily understood from the standpoint of these stories. These stories will help you, help all of us. The world as it is presented to people is an illusion. That doesn't mean that the real world is not there. It just means that the world as it's presented to you is an illusion. For example, the United States is a completely bankrupt country. The United States has been completely and thoroughly bankrupt since approximately the early 1990s. That is for the past 3 decades. But that, of course, runs completely counter to the experience of at least the top 5% of the country, which has untold, in many cases, untold tens of billions, certainly tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. And so if you say, well, the United States is bankrupt, then people point to this and they say to you, that's impossible. Look at look at the wealth. And then people also look at some people get to look at their stock portfolios or their investments in Google or whatever, and they say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. It is nonetheless true. For example, the United States, which complains about the steel production in Canada, refuses to face the fact that the United States blew up all of its steel plants in the 1980s. So the reason that the Canadians, who used to supply iron ore to the United States steel plants on the other side of the Great Lakes, the southern side of the Great Lakes, in Pittsburgh and places like that, began to build their own steel factories. It would surprise Americans to know that America is right now exporting oil to Nigeria to be refined in Nigeria because we have not built refinery capacity in the United States for decades, and much of our refinery capacity is in repair. It would startle people to realize that one of the major reasons why there has to be an actual discussion with the Russians is because the United States cannot produce the weapons that the Russians can produce at anything like the rates that the Russians produce them, even if it wanted to. So, and it would also surprise people to really understand that this meeting was not asked for by Putin, but was requested by Trump. Now, Putin is not saying that. Vladimir Putin, let's remember, was the head of the KGB. One thing that people should know is that Putin does an average of 20 meetings per day. Yesterday, he did between 30 and 35 meetings, meaning that he, for example, spoke yesterday to the presidents of South Africa, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, China also, Xi Jinping, and India, in addition to the meetings he did. So you're talking about someone of significant, in fact, prodigious intellect, who recognizes the character of the problem that Trump finds himself in many different ways. And he recognizes other elements, which is that there is a long-standing, decades-long process in the United States, particularly since 9/11, when Putin was in power at that time, back in 9/11, in which the presidents of the United States have been superseded in terms of the wielding of power by a combination of intelligence agencies. And the people of the United States have decided, out of fear largely, and a desire to not be held themselves individually accountable, have acquiesced to that. People don't like to hear that. They don't like to be told that. But as was once said, people get the government they deserve. And so the governments we've seen in the United States since 9/11 are the product of a fundamental weakness in the American population, not merely the electorate. The stories we're reading deal with this or go after this problem. I'm going to take another 3 or 4 minutes here just to give you a sense of this. So
Yeah, Dennis, just real quick, there was breaking news that Trump did just announce, as you were talking, that he's going to meet Putin in Alaska on August 15th. And I just thought I should let the people know here who are watching live too, who may want to know that.
Okay, well, since Alaska is about 30 miles from Russia, People they don't even know. That's a good idea. You know, it's like the closest place that you could do it. Uh, by the way, Alaska, let's remember, was Russian and was given to the United States at a deal with the Lincoln administration. Seward, who was the Secretary of State, and happens to represent one of the cases of the close collaboration between the Russians and the United States, which existed for the entire history of the United States up until the Cold War, 1945. Up until the Cold War, the closest of allies to the United States had been Russia from the time of the inception of the United States, something that we could take up at some other point, or others can take up. So this story, as I referenced, was published November of 1842. And comes after a story that Poe had written the year before called Murders in the Rue Morgue. That story, published in 1841, was the invention of what we today know as the detective story, and it was Edgar Poe who invented it. There are many issues that Poe is dealing with in these stories, but he's dealing with a very particular idea about analysis, or the factor of analysis. What he argues in the earlier story is that when people talk about the poetical imagination and the mathematical imagination, they think about these as being separate. But he says, actually, there is a relationship, though the poetic imagination is of a higher order intellectually than mathematics, according to Poe. And he seeks in these stories to demonstrate this, though he talks about what he calls as a calculus or an analytical capability. One paragraph from that earlier story, just to give an idea about this, he says, it cannot be doubted that the mental features discoursed of as analytical are in themselves but little susceptible of analysis. We appreciate them only in their effects. We know of them, among other things, they are always to their possessor a source of the liveliest enjoyment, as the strong man exults in his physical ability, delighting in such exercises as call his muscles into action. So glories the analyst in that moral activity which disentangles. He derives pleasure from even the most trivial occupations, bringing his talent into play. He is fond of enigmas, of conundrums, of hieroglyphics, exhibiting in his solutions of each and all a degree of acumen which appears to the ordinary apprehension to be preternatural, supernatural. His results, brought about by the very soul and essence of method, have in truth the whole air of intuition. A good example of that, by the way, is in classical music, the composers Mozart and Beethoven, and also J.S. Bach, all of whom were known, by the way, for their capacity for improvisation. Some of you may know that people try to claim that it's only in jazz is distinguished by improvisation. Not so. Classical music at its root was improvisational. And Beethoven used to get involved in duels with other pianists as a young man, in which the major way that he would win is to improvise, and did all sorts of things. At one of them being at one point taking a composition by a competitor, turning it upside down, finding a section, it was particularly a cello part. He just took that section and then did it improvisation on that section, having never seen it. So, and Mozart was known for the similar kind of things. So when Poe is talking about the analytical capability and its relationship to the imagination, that's a good way of thinking about what's referred to here. So what happened, because I want to leave some time to read the story, I'm going to just catch people up, and we're going to start the story. You'll find it there, Jose, you or someone should look right now, and it will begin with the sentences. It's about 5 pages in. It remained Marie Roget left the residence of her mother.
Yeah, I got it pulled up here.
Okay, great. So that's where you start. So I'm just going to give people a summary where things are. Okay, this story is about a real murder which had happened in New York, but Poe writes about it in November 1842 before it was solved. His story is a solution to the real murder of a woman named Mary Rogers. He changes the name to Marie Roget, and he sets the story in the Paris of his original detective, whose name was Charles C. Auguste Dupin, or that was his name, Dupin. I'll just leave it at that. Um, so this story that we are reading talks about how Dupin had become a household word among the police department, because he never revealed to them how he had solved an earlier mystery that nobody was able to solve. And that's what the first story is about, the murders in the Rue Morgue. That one was not a real murder. That was just Poe writing a story, and then this is an application by Poe to a real case, the murder of Mary Rogers. So in the story, you hear a lot of French names and French streets, but what's really being talked about is Lower Manhattan, the West Side, I believe, the Hudson River, and so forth. There are substitutions that exist in some of the texts. We're not using the substitutions. What they're doing here is just reading along with the French. So to give you an idea of what has happened so far, and then people will take it up from here. Marie Rogers, Marie Roget, was the only daughter of a woman who her father died in infancy, in her infancy. She's about 22, 23 years old when she's murdered. And What she had been doing is she and her mother have been operating a boarding house. It's called a pension here. So it was run by her with the mother. And then what had happened was when she was 22 years old, a guy in the area who was selling perfume approached her with a deal that she should be one of the people, like a sales girl, basically. She was very pretty. And so what happened was this became really well known, and a lot of people went there, a lot of men went there, and so on. And she worked for about a year, and then suddenly disappeared for about a week. Everybody was about to investigate it when she suddenly showed up after a week. She never said what happened. She claimed that she had been at the house of a relation in the country, but her mother really never said what happened. Her mother itself was also distraught. So she went back to work and stayed there for a very short period of time, and then went back to work with her mother at the boarding house. Now, 5 months after that, so there was a year that she had worked there at this perfume shop, disappeared, then came back, quit pretty quickly after that. And then 5 months later, she disappeared again. When she disappeared the second time, 4 days later, her body was found floating in the Hudson River. Okay. And then what happened was that rewards were put out for her, the apprehension of the killer. The first reward is called 1,000 francs. Nothing showed up. It was tripled to 3,000 francs. Nothing showed up the second or third week. Then it went up to 30,000 francs. Then still nothing showed up. Then an additional 10,000. I'm sorry, it was 20,000 francs, and then it went to 30,000 because there was a separate group of concerned citizens, that put up more money. Still nobody could solve it. And so the prefect of police, who's a character from the first story, comes to see Dupin and his sidekick. His sidekick is never really named. I don't remember his name. He's the one telling us the story. Um, and so the prefect of police comes, he talks, and he spends 8 hours, 7 or 8 hours, telling them all the details of the case. While he's telling them the details of the case, the narrator, the guy that is telling us the story, is asking him different questions. But Dupin, who is the great intellect that solves the case, he's sleeping the whole time. He's sitting there with glasses on, probably dark glasses, and he sleeps through the whole thing. So then what happens is the next day he sends out his friend, our narrator, to get all the newspapers about this. And so what you're going to be doing is what Poe did. We're put in a position what Poe did, which is he read different newspapers about this case, and on the basis of the newspapers he collected, was able to come up with a solution to it. Okay, so that's where we're picking up the story, and you guys go ahead and you'll be you go ahead with the readings, okay? And make sure that now, Jose, you guys are now taking this over. Can't hear you.
That's awkward. That never happens. All right. Thank you, Dennis, for your orientation. And yes, some people were pointing out in the comments and in the chat that we had ended a little after this, but I think this is probably a more appropriate place to start because there's new people on. For
Right.
example, we just did this thing earlier with Aguilar and others, so I know there's new people on who've never been on before. And one thing you said was that what we are witnessing or what we're reading is the invention of the detective story.
Yes.
So we're picking up at the point, just so I can double down on this, where we are now going to get the facts, or at least the newspaper clippings and the
The same
various.
thing that Poe got, basically. That's what he's doing here. So we are now doing, you're now from this point, you're put in the same position roughly. I don't know that these are the exact accounts because these are written by Poe, but that's what he's doing. Okay?
All right. So thank you, Dennis. I will take you off the screen, and we are going to read for everybody who's still on with us. We're going to read from for the next half hour. We try to end by 7 o'clock. We just do a nice solid hour. That's mostly because we have our friend Diane Sarah, who does her own symposium every Friday night at 7 p.m. So without further ado, let's just begin. I will start us off, and then we have people here in the room, and then we have some people on StreamYard as well. So here we go. I will start. Marie Roget left the residence of her mother in the Rue Pavée Saint André about 9 o'clock in the morning of Sunday, June the 22nd, 18. In going out, she gave notice to a Monsieur Jacques Eustache, and to him only, of her intention to spend the day with an aunt who resided in the Rue de Drôme. The Rue de Drôme is a short and narrow but populous thoroughfare, not far from the banks of the river, and at a distance of some 2 miles in the most direct course possible from the pension of Madame Roget. Saint Eustache was the accepted suitor of Marie, and lodged, as well as took his meals, at the pension. He was to have gone for his betrothed at dusk, and to have escorted her home. In the afternoon, however, it came on to rain heavily, and supposing that she would remain all night at her aunt's, as she had done under similar circumstances before, he did not think it necessary to keep his promise. As night drew on, Madame Roget, who was an infirm old lady, 70 years of age, was heard to express a fear that she would never see Marie again. But this observation attracted little attention at the time. On Monday, it was ascertained that the girl had not been to the Rue de Drôme, and when the day elapsed without tidings of her, a tardy search was instituted at several points in the city and its environs. It was not, however, until the fourth day from the period of her disappearance that anything satisfactory was ascertained respecting her. On this day, Wednesday, the 25th of June, a Monsieur Bouvard, who was with a friend, had been making inquiries for Marie near the Barrière du Roulet, on the shore of the Seine, which is opposite the Rue Pavée Saint André, was informed that a corpse had just been towed ashore by some fishermen who had found it floating in the river. Upon seeing the body, Bouvet, after some hesitation, identified it as that of the perfumery girl. His friend recognized it more promptly. The face was suffused with dark blood, some of which issued from the mouth. No foam was seen, as in the case of the merely drowned. There was no discoloration in the cellular tissue. About the throat were bruises and impressions of fingers. The arms were bent over on the chest and were rigid. The right hand was clenched, the left partially open. On the left wrist were two circular excoriations, apparently the effect of ropes or of a rope in more than one volution. A part of the right wrist also was much chafed, as well as the back throughout its extent, but more especially as the shoulder blades. In bringing the body to the shore, the fisherman had attached it to a rope. In bringing the body to the shore, the fisherman had attached to it a rope, but none of the excoriations had been affected by this. The flesh of the neck was much swollen. There were no cuts apparent or bruises which appeared the effect of blows. A piece of lace was found so tightly around the neck as to be hidden from sight. It was completely buried in the flesh and was fastened by a knot which lay just under the left ear. This alone would have sufficed to produce death. The medical testimony spoke confidently of the virtuous character of the deceased. She had been subjected to brutal violence. The corpse was in such condition when found that there could have been no difficulty in its recognition by friends. The dress was much torn and otherwise disordered in the outer The dress was much torn and otherwise disordered. In the outer garment, a slip about a foot wide had been torn upward from the bottom hem to the waist, but not torn off. It was wound 3 times around the waist and secured by a sort of hitch in the back. The dress immediately beneath the frock was of fine muslin, and from this a slip 18 inches wide had been torn entirely out, torn very evenly and with great care. It was found around her neck, fitting loosely and secured with a hard knot. Over this muslin slip and the slip of lace, the strings of a bonnet were attached, the bonnet being appended. The knot by which the strings of the bonnet were fastened was not a lady's, but a slip or sailor's knot. After the recognition of the corpse, it was not, as usual, taken to the morgue, this formality being superfluous, but hastily interred not far from the spot at which it was brought ashore. Through the exertions of Bouvard, the matter was industriously hushed up as far as possible, and several days had elapsed before any public emotion resulted. A weekly paper, however, at length took up the theme. The corpse was disinterred and a re-examination instituted, and nothing was elicited beyond what has been already noted. The clothes, however, were now submitted to the mother and friends of the deceased and fully identified as those worn by the girl upon leaving home. Meantime, the excitement increased hourly. Several individuals were arrested and discharged. Saint Eustache fell especially under suspicion, and he failed at first to give an intelligible account of his whereabouts during the Sunday on which Marie left home. Subsequently, however, he submitted to Monsieur G. affidavits, accounting satisfactorily for every hour of the day in question. As time passed and no discovery ensued, 1,000 contradictory rumors were circulated, and journalists busied themselves in suggestions. Among these, the one which attracted the most notice was the idea that Marie Roget still lived, that the corpse found in the Zine was that of some other unfortunate. It will be proper that I submit to the reader some passages which embody the suggestion alluded to. These passages are literal translations from L'Etoile, a small daily print conducted in general with much ability. So, let's see. Ashley, if you're there, I may bring you up to take over, and then we'll go to somebody here in the room. Yes, here you are. Great. Go for it.
Okay. Mademoiselle Roget left her mother's house on Sunday morning, June the 22nd, 18, with the ostensible purpose of going to see her aunt or some other connection in the Rue de Jaume. From that hour, nobody is proved to have seen her. There is no trace or tidings of her at all. There is no person whatever can come forward so far who saw her at all on that day after she left her mother's door. Now, though, we have no evidence that Marie Roget was in the land of the living after 9 o'clock on Sunday, June the 22nd. We have proof that up to that hour she was alive. On Wednesday noon at 12, a female body was discovered afloat on the shore of the Barrière de Roux. This was even if we presume that Marie Roget was thrown into the river within 3 hours after she left her mother's house. Only 3 days from the time she left her home, 3 days to an hour. But it is folly to suppose that the murder, if murder was committed on her body, could have been consummated soon enough to have enabled her murderers to throw the body into the river before midnight. Those who are guilty of such horrid crimes choose darkness rather than light. Thus, we see that if the body found in the river was not of Marie Roget, it could only have been in the water 2.5 days or 3 at the outside. All experience has shown that drowned bodies or bodies thrown into the water immediately after death by violence require from 6 to 10 days for sufficient decomposition to take place to bring them to the top of the water. Even where a cannon is fired over a corpse and it rises before at least 5 or 6 days immersion, it sinks again, if let alone. Now we ask, what was there in this case to cause a departure from the ordinary course of nature? If the body had been kept in its mangled state on shore until Tuesday night, some trace would have been found on shore of the murderers. It is a doubtful point also whether the body would be so soon afloat even were it thrown in after having been dead 2 days. And furthermore, it is exceedingly improbable that any villains who had committed such a murder as is here supposed would have thrown the body in without weight to sink it, when such a precaution could have so easily been taken. The editor here proceeds to argue that the body must have been in the water not 3 days merely, but at least 5 times 3 days, because it was so far decomposed that Beauvais had great difficulty in recognizing it. This latter point, however, was duly disproved. We continue our translation. What then are the facts on which M. Beauvais says that he has no doubt the body was that of Marie Roget? He ripped up the gown sleeves and says he found marks which satisfied him of the identity. The public generally supposed those marks to have consisted of some description of scars. He rubbed the arm and found hair upon it, something as indefinite, we think, as can readily be imagined, as little conclusive as finding an arm in the sleeve. M. Beauvais did not return that night, but sent word to Madame Roget at 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening that investigation was still in progress respecting her daughter. If we allow that Madame Roget, from her age and grief, could not go over, which is allowing a great deal, there certainly must have been someone who would have thought it worthwhile to go over and attend the investigation if they thought the body was that of Marie. Nobody went over. There was nothing said or heard about the matter in the Rue Pavie Saint-André that reached even the occupants of the same building. M. Saint Eustache, the lover and intended husband of Marie, who boarded in her mother's house, deposes that he did not hear of the discovery of the body of his intended until the next morning, when M. Beauvais came into his chamber and told him of it. For an item of news like this, it strikes us it was very coolly received. In this way, the journal endeavored to create the impression of an apathy on the part of the relatives of Marie, inconsistent with the supposition that these relatives believed the corpse to be hers. Its insinuations amount to this, that Marie, with the connivance of her friends, had absented herself from the city for reasons involving a charge against her chastity, and that these friends, upon the discovery of a corpse in the Seine, somewhat resembling that of the girl, had availed themselves of the opportunity to impress the public with the belief of her death. But L'Etoile was again over hasty. It was distinctly proved that no apathy such as was imagined existed, that the old lady was exceedingly feeble and so agitated as to be unable to attend to any duty, that Saint Eustache, so far from receiving the news coolly, was distracted with grief and bore himself so frantically that M. Beauvais prevailed upon a friend and relative to take charge of him and prevent his attending the examination at the disinterment. Moreover, although it was stated by L'Etoile that the corpse was reinterred at the public expense, that an advantageous offer of private sepulture was absolutely declined by the family, and that no member of the family attended the ceremonial. Although I say all this was asserted by L'Etoile in furtherance of the impression it designed to convey, yet all this was satisfactorily disproved. In a subsequent number of the paper, an attempt was made to throw suspicion upon Beauvais himself. The editor says, "Now then, a change comes over the matter. We're told that on the occasion while a Madame B was at Madame Roget's house, M. Beauvais, who was going out, told her that a gendarme was expected there, and that she, Madame B, was not say anything to the gendarme until he returned, but let the matter be for him. In the present posture of affairs, Mbavé appears to have the whole matter locked up in his head. A single step cannot be taken without Mbavé, for go which way you will, you run against him. For some reason, he determined that nobody shall have anything to do with the proceedings but himself, and he has elbowed the male relatives out of the way according to their representations in a very singular manner. He seems to have been very much averse to permitting the relatives to see the body. Some color was given to the suspicion thus thrown upon Beauvais by the following fact. A visitor at his office a few days prior to the girl's disappearance and during the absence of his occupant had observed a rose in the keyhole of the door and the name Marie inscribed upon a slate which hung near at hand. The general impression so far as we were enabled to glean it from the newspapers seemed to be that Marie had been the victim of a gang of desperados, that by these she had been borne across the river, maltreated and murdered. La Commerciale, however, a prince of extensive influence, was earnest in combating this popular idea. I quote a passage of two from its columns. We are persuaded that pursuit has hitherto been on false scents, so far as it has been directed to the Barrière de Roule. It is impossible that a person so well known to thousands as this young woman was should have passed 3 blocks without someone having seen her, and anyone who saw her would have remembered it, for she interested all who knew her. It was when the streets were full of people when she went out. It is impossible that she could have gone to the Barrière de Roule or the Rue de Drôme without being recognized by a dozen persons. Yet no one has come forward who saw her outside of her mother's door, and there is no evidence, except the testimony concerning her expressed intentions, that she did go out at all. Her gown was torn, bound round her, and tied, and by that the body was carried a bundle. If the murder had been committed at the Barrière de Roule, there would have been no necessity for such an arrangement. The fact that the body was found floating near the barrière is no proof as to where it was thrown into the water. A piece of one of the unfortunate girl's petticoats, 2 feet long and 1 foot wide, was torn out and tied under her chin around the back of her head, probably to prevent screams. This was done by fellows who had no pocket handkerchief. Handkerchief. A day or two before the prefect called upon us, however, some important information reached the police, which seemed to overthrow at least the chief portion of La Commerciale's argument. 2 small boys, sons of Madame de Luc, while roaming among the woods near the Barrière de Roule, chanced to penetrate a close thicket within which were 3 or 4 large stones forming a kind of seat with a back and footstool. On the upper stone lay a white petticoat, on the second a silk scarf. A parasol, gloves, and a pocket handkerchief were also found. The handkerchief bore the name Marie Roget. Fragments of dress were discovered on the brambles around. The earth was trampled, the bushes were broken, and there was every evidence of a struggle. Between the thicket and the river, the fences were found taken down, and the ground bore evidence of some heavy burden having been dragged along it. A weekly paper, Le Soleil, had the following comments upon this discovery, comments which merely echoed the sentiment of the whole Parisian press.
I'll have Kynan. We can have someone else come in now. Thank you, Ashley. All right. Okay.
The things had all evidently been there at least 3 or 4 weeks. They were all mildewed down hard with the action of the rain and stuck together from mildew. The grass had grown around and over some of them. The silk on the parasol was strong, but the threads of it were run together within. The upper part, where it had been doubled and folded, was all mildewed and rotten and tore on its being opened. The pieces of her frock torn out by the bushes were about 3 inches wide and 6 inches long. One part was the hem of the frock and it had been mended. The other piece was part of the skirt, not the hem. They looked like strips torn off and were on the thorn bush, about a foot from the ground. There can be no doubt, therefore, that the spot of this appalling outrage has been discovered. Consequent upon this discovery, new evidence appeared. Madame Deluc testified that she keeps a roadside inn not far from the bank of the river, opposite the Barrière du Roule. The neighborhood is secluded, particularly so. It is the usual Sunday resort of blackguards from the city who crosses the river in boats. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the Sunday in question, a young girl arrived at the inn, accompanied by a young man of dark complexion. The two remained here for some time. On their departure, they took the road to some thick woods in the vicinity. Madame Deluc's attention was called to the dress worn by the girl, on account of its resemblance to one worn by a deceased relative. A scarf was particularly noticed. Soon after the departure of the couple, a gang of miscreants made their appearance, behaved boisterously, ate and drank without making payment, followed in the route of the young man and girl, returned to the inn about dusk, and recrossed the river as if in great haste. It was soon after dark, upon this same evening, that Madame Deluc, as well as her eldest son, heard the screams of a female in the vicinity of the inn. The screams were violent, but brief. Madame D recognized not only the scarf which was found in the thicket, but the dress which was discovered upon the corpse. An omnibus driver, Valence, now also testified that he saw Marie Roget cross a ferry on the Seine on the Sunday in question, in company with a young man of dark complexion. He, Valence, knew Marie and could not be mistaken in her identity. The articles found in the thicket were fully identified by the relatives of Marie. The items of evidence and information thus collected by myself from the newspapers at the suggestion of Dupin embrace only one more point, but this was a point of seemingly vast consequence. It appears that, immediately after the discovery of the clothes as above described, the lifeless or nearly lifeless body of Saint Eustache, Marie's betrothed, was found in the vicinity of which all now suppose the scene of the outrage. A phial labeled laudanum and emptied was found near him. His breath gave evidence of the poison. He died without speaking. Upon his person was found a letter, briefly stating his love for Marie, with his design of self-destruction. I need scarcely tell you, said Dupin, as he finished the perusal of my notes, that this is a far more intricate case than that of the Rue Morgue, from which it differs in one important respect. This is an ordinary, although an atrocious instance of crime. There is nothing peculiarly outre about it. You will observe that, for this reason, the mystery has been considered easy when, for this reason, it should have been considered difficult of solution. Thus, at first, it was thought unnecessary to offer a reward. The myrmidons of G were able at once to comprehend how and why such an atrocity might have been committed. They could picture to their imaginations a mode, many modes, and a motive, many motives. And because it was not impossible that either of these numerous modes and motives could have been the actual one, they have taken it for granted that one of them must. but the ease with which these variable fancies were entertained, and the very plausibility which each assumed, should have been understood as indicative rather of the difficulties than of the facilities which must attend elucidation. I have before observed that it is by prominences above the plane of the ordinary that reason feels her way, if at all, in her search for the true, and that the proper question in cases such as this is not so much what has occurred as what has occurred that has never occurred before. In the investigations at the house of Madame L'Espanaye, the agents of G were discouraged and confounded by that very unusualness which, to a properly regulated intellect, would have afforded the surest omen of success, while this same intellect might have been plunged in despair at the ordinary character of all that met the eye in the case of the perfumery girl, and yet told of nothing but easy triumph to the functionaries of the prefecture. In the case of Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter, there was, even at the beginning of our investigation, no doubt that murder had been committed. The idea of suicide was excluded at once. Here, too, we are freed, at the commencement, from all supposition of self-murder. The body found at the Barrière du Roule was found under such circumstances as to leave us no room for embarrassment upon this important point. But it has been suggested that the corpse discovered is not that of the Marie Roget, for the conviction of whose assassin or assassins the reward is offered, and respecting whom solely our agreement has been arranged with the prefect. We both know this gentleman well. It will not do to trust him too far. If, dating our inquiries from the body found, and thence tracing a murderer, we yet discover this body to be that of some other individual than Marie, or if starting from the living Marie, we yet find her unassassinated, in either case we lose our labor, since it is Monsieur G with whom we have to deal. For our own purpose, therefore, if not for the purpose of justice, it is indispensable that our first step should be the determination of the identity of the corpse with the Marie Roget who is missing.
With the public arguments of L'Etoile have had weight, and that journal itself is convinced of their importance and would appear from the manner in which it commences one of its essays on the subject. Quote, several of the morning papers of the day, it says, speak of the conclusive article in Monday's L'Etoile. To me, this article appears conclusive of little beyond the zeal of its inditer. I should bear in mind that, in general, it is the object of our newspapers rather to create a sensation, to make a point, than to further the cause of truth. The latter end is only pursued when it is coincident with the former. The print, which merely falls into the ordinary opinion, however well founded this opinion may be, earns for itself no credit with the mob. The mass of people regard as profound only him who suggests pungent contradictions to the general idea. In rationation, not less in literature, it is the epigram which is most immediately and most universally appreciated. In both, it is the lowest order of merit. What I mean to say is that it is the mingled epigram and melodrama of the idea that Marie Roget still lives, rather than any true plausibility of this idea, which have suggested it to Le Tollet and secured it a favorable reception with the public. Let us examine the heads of this journal's argument, endeavoring to avoid the incoherence with which it is originally set forth. The first aim of the writer is to show, from the brevity of the interval between Marie's disappearance and the finding of the floating corpse, that this corpse cannot be that of Marie. The reduction of this interval to its smallest possible dimensions becomes thus at once an object with the reasoner. In the rash pursuit of this object, he rushes into mere assumption at the outset. It is folly to suppose, he says, that the murder, if murder was committed on her body, could have been consummated soon enough to have enabled her murderers to throw the body into the river before midnight. We demand at once, and very naturally, why? Why is it folly to suppose that the murder was committed within 5 minutes after the girl's quitting of her mother's house? Why is it folly to suppose that the murder was committed at any given period of the day? There have been assassinations at all hours, but had the murder taken place at any moment between 9 o'clock and the morning of Sunday and a quarter before midnight, there would still have been enough time to, quote, throw the body into the river before midnight. This assumption, then, amounts precisely to this, that the murder was not committed on Sunday at all. And if we allow Le Tollet to assume this, we may permit it any liberties whatever. The paragraph beginning, quote, it is folly to suppose that the murder, etc., however it appears as printed in Le Tollet, may be imagined to have existed actually thus in the brain of its indicter. It is folly to suppose that the murder, if murder was committed on the body, could have been committed soon enough to have enabled her murderers to throw the body into the river before midnight. It is folly, we say, to suppose all this, and to suppose at the same time, as we are resolved to suppose, that the body was not thrown into the river until after midnight. End quote. A sentence sufficiently inconsequential in itself, but not so utterly preposterous as the one printed. Were it my purpose, continued Dupin, merely to make out a case against this passage of Le Tollet's argument, I might safely leave it where it is. It is not, however. With Le Tollet, what we have to do, it is not, however, with Le Tollet that we have to do, but with truth. The sentence in question has but one meaning as it stands, and this meaning I have fairly stated, but it is material that we go behind the mere words for an idea which these words have obviously intended and failed to convey. It was the design of the journalist to say that at whatever period of the day or night of Sunday this murder was committed, it was improbable that the assassins would have ventured to bear the corpse to the river before midnight. And herein lies really the assumption of which I complain. It is assumed that the murder was committed at such a position and under such circumstances that the bearing it to the river became necessary. Now, the assassination might have taken place upon the river's brink or on the river itself, and thus the throwing of the corpse in the water might not have been resorted to at any period of the day or night as the most obvious. The throwing of the corpse in the water might have been resorted to at any period of the day or night, and as the most obvious, the most immediate mode of disposal. You will understand that I am suggesting nothing here as probable or as coincident with my own opinion. My design so far has no reference to the facts of the case. I merely wish to caution you against the whole tone of Le Tollet's suggestion by calling your attention to its ex parte character at the outset. Having prescribed thus a limit to the suit in its own preconceived notions, having assumed that if this were the body of Marie, it could have been in the water but a very brief time, the journal goes on to say, quote, all experience has shown that drowned bodies or bodies thrown into the water immediately after death by violence require from 6 to 10 days for sufficient decomposition to take place to bring them to the top of the water. Even when a cannon is fired over the corpse and it rises before at least 5 or 6 days immersion, it sinks again if it's let alone, unquote. These assertions have been tacitly received by every paper in Paris, with the exception of Le Moniteur. This latter print endeavors to combat the portion of the paragraph which has reference to, quote, drowned bodies, only by citing some 5 or 6 instances in which bodies of individuals known to be drowned were found floating after the lapse of less time than is insisted upon by Le Tollet. But there is something excessively unphilosophical in the attempt on the part of Le Moniteur to rebut the general assertion of Le Tollet by a citation of particular instances militating against that assertion. Had it been possible to adduce 50 instead of 5 examples of bodies found floating at the end of 2 or 3 days, these 50 examples could still have been properly regarded only as exceptions to Le Tollet's rule, until such time as the rule itself should be confuted. Admitting the rule, and this Le Moniteur does not deny, insisting merely upon its exception, the argument of Le Tollet is suffered to remain in full force. For this argument does not pretend to involve more than a question of probability of the body having risen to the surface in less than 3 days. And this probability will be in favor of Le Tollet's position until the instances so childishly adduced shall be sufficient in number to establish an antagonistical rule.
That's
Okay.
part 1 on my version here.
Okay.
I think because you
Oh.
have the whole story printed, this is just part 1.
Oh, okay. So this
Which is a
good place.
Good place
Yeah.
to start because it is 7:05. So, all right. I guess you got to tune in again next week for part 3. But thank you all for tuning in, and as always, vote Vega.nyc. I'm just gonna end the stream now.